Okay, welcome everyone. This is the second day of the lectures. Now we're going to listen to Jacob, so enjoy. We're going to have 20 minutes at the end for questions, so don't be shy about the questions. Thank you.
Right, okay, here we go. Hi everyone, thank you for joining me this morning. My name is Dr. Jacob Canet-Gibson. I'm an artist and practice-led researcher from Perth, Western Australia. And today I'm going to be presenting notation, tripartite hauntogenic construction systems as a response to the lost future. So you'll see on the screen right now is one of the covers from Samuel R. Delany's novel Dahlgren, published in 1975. In Dahlgren, the approximation of a protagonist that the text has, the kid, spelt with two Ds, wanders this post-apocalyptic portion of Midwestern America. He arrives at an ambiguous city cut off from the rest of the country called Bologna. And it's cut off from the city and the rest of America from a great bridge. And across the bridge, the city burns to the ground every day and returns miraculously to normal the following morning. Street signs switch and morph. Geographical logic is completely tossed out the window. What was once the path to one place becomes one that takes you to an entirely other location. The introduction to the novel, much like the rest of the text, is quite infamous, but it begins with a sexual escapade between the protagonist and a woman, and the woman then inexplicably and horrifyingly transforms herself into a tree. The kid descends into a cavern, and in this cavern, he discovered what is called an optical chain, a heavy metal-linked neck piece covered in many lenses and prisms, all of which reflect light off one another in varying ways. Each themselves a lens through which to observe the world. The optical chain functions physically as this kind of immense burden, this immense burden of the multiplicity of interpretation and perspective. Throughout the text, the kid encounters many others who have similar optical chains, each themselves also so traumatized by the acquisition of such an item that they refuse to explain how they themselves received it. Furthermore, removing the chain often causes bad luck to befall its previous wearer, typically fatally bad luck. So upon crossing the bridge, the kid receives a book from a woman outside the entrance to the city, and he discovers the book is his own. It's actually his own journal. And the book details everything which he has done and everything that will happen next to him. And this makes the book itself quite a difficult read, with the past and the present and the future continually crossing and cutting one another off. The journal entries slice through present tense events and chronology, and soon it's nearly impossible to make out which direction things are happening, whether they've happened before or are yet to happen. So for the point of the paper, I'm going to skip to the conclusion. I'm going to spoil a little bit of this novel, unfortunately. But after many days of kind of horrific violence and sexual abuse, both enacted and received, the protagonist, the kid, he flees the city and he tosses the journal back to the woman from whom he received it. He crosses the bridge out of town, and in kind of this horrifying moment of circularity, we arrive back at the opening line of the novel. The narrative then inevitably repeats itself again. And seemingly the kid and many of the characters within the text are aware of this cyclical quality. and this metatextuality. And so Dahlgren becomes a text not so much about the narrative itself, but about the idea of authorship, the placement of the characters, their lives, their experiences, the system of logic within which the plot operates by. These are all constructions, and it's due to the author, and then following that, how that is filtered through our interpretation of the reader. And so what it becomes about is how do we treat the things that we create, and how do we interpret them, and why might that be the case? And furthermore, many of these mysteries are extremely mundane. The answers to the things such as why the street signs switch or why things collapse and are rebuilt, fail to give us resolution. The answer itself only leads to more conclusion. The street signs, which I've mentioned, are in fact actually just reordered by a man with a ladder and a screwdriver early in the morning. And so partway through the book, the protagonist encounters him swapping the street signs. And when asked why, it's never explained. And so the banality of the answer only becomes even stranger as to then that question about authorship. Why was this kind of the conclusion we were given? And so we begin to question purpose and meaning. So in this, I sort of see a Dahlgrenian logic to the hauntological context of the contemporary world. Mismatched by technology for seeming no reason, cut and spliced, history mangled and rearranged. I see in Dahlgren much as I see the function of the camera, a tool of segmentation and dismemberment, the siloing off of parts of the body, their exaggeration, so on, which is sort of a form of what we might call fetishism, the selection and demarcation of sections. And so in this sort of hauntogenic, Dahlgrenian-esque contemporary world, meaning is pulled apart, context and concepts are rearranged, and chronology perhaps makes less sense than we expect. So we get all these different sections, rearrangements of forms and figures. I just want to touch on this very briefly. It's a work by Paul Sutherland. He wrote a review recently for an exhibition of mine, not for this work, but I think it's very fitting. And what Paul says here is that it has an exhibitionist element. This is data. It's what you're not supposed to see. This is the ugliness beneath the facade, and now it's exposed. You can take a look. And that's kind of the focus of my work, this idea of looking at underneath, what is hidden underneath the things that we see every day, what is hidden underneath what we hear, and what is hidden underneath the images that construct those things, which is technology, data, etc. And there's a historical element too, which we'll get into. But for introductory purposes, the image we have in front of us is the image that Derrida uses when he's discussing hauntology. And this is from Hamlet, when the ghost of his father reappears. And so with hauntology, there's this futuristic sort of expectation. We dream forward of what things could be. And these expectant dreams recur time and time again. And when we reach the present and it fails us, we are let down, it doesn't reach the level of our dreams, we retreat to the past. And so these past dreams, these lost futures, come back over and over again, as if the apocalypse has already come and gone, and come and gone, and come and gone, much like Dahlgren. And so where I'm based, where I'm currently talking to you now, in Perth, Western Australia, which is the most isolated city in the world, I exist in one of the most brutal and ongoing colonialist projects in history. And so in that context, what becomes of time? How does place and space operate within this? And potentially, how can this be leveraged to kind of examine itself, to question itself? I wonder, are kind of these Baudrillardian fatal strategies or Deleuze-Guattarian lines of flight even possible? Are there novel ways of divergence in such a context? And so I understand this has been quite poetic, but with this kind of general series of concerns established, thankfully, I'm sure, I will be moving on to focus on things in a way that's more practical and structural. So, to introduce things, Hauntology and Fisher's notion of the lost future outline the world wherein the present is a perpetual return to the past interpretation of the future. In this world, chronology, if not time and history itself, are completely evaporated. This evaporated or cloud-like state is the result of mass-reproduced digital technology. I argue, however, that this may in fact be a plane of immanence of some kind, or perhaps an entryway into such a conception. And I'll quickly acknowledge here for the delusians that may be among us, or those who are aware, that I acknowledge that the phraseology of entranceway is somewhat of a misnomer. As a slight counterpoint, perhaps I would suggest, we think of the entrance in the same way that one might think of the gateless gate from Buddhist tradition, and we'll delve more into the Deleuze part in detail. But for introductory purposes, let's sort of consider it sort of a demarcation point. And so with all of that sort of discussed, what happens to the ruins and remnants of history, to sound and to images in such a place like this, especially in these contexts in so-called Australia? Structurally, what am I going to present today? It's in two parts. So I'm going to give a theoretical background. I'm going to attempt to establish a continuum of thought within sonification and hauntology, eventually looking at the function of these ideas in the production of what I'm calling notation, art, sound objects. Hence the title notation, as it's called, with the three letters, because it's three parts forming a notation form, and why they're tripartite systems divided in three. And then there's going to be a practical part of this, where I'm going to look at the results of what I've done so far. We're going to look at one of these creative outputs, a work called Agnosis and Black Powder Tongue, which has a soundscape, a visual art, and a notation, or like a composition component to it. And what are my aims with this? Primarily, I want to produce a system where in varying spaces, as in physical spaces, locations, may be explored via soundscape, visual art, and notation, all of which is derived from the data of digital photographs. So these are not arbitrary connections or sort of abstract workings as representation, though that is a part of it. They are, in fact, direct output of that information. Secondly, I want to examine if digital photographic data, primarily in an auditory context, can be used to explore no longer existing sites beyond the capacity of the pictorial or the image. And then I want to investigate if this can draw out any potential hauntogenic qualities. The final bit I'm kind of interested in is, very broadly speaking, to further inquiry into the field of hauntology via the inclusion of this tripartite construction system and its role in the plane of immanence. This extends my doctoral research, which was recently completed in November last year, into this sort of further, more abstracted, post-documentary, speculative space. So, for the theoretical background, here are the three main things we're going to cover. Hauntology, the lost future, and the concept of non-things. Then we're going to look at Necker cubes and multi-stable perception. And then lastly, I will attempt something very foolish and try and explain Deleuze and the plane of immanence. But again, with hauntology, we need to go back to where it starts, which is with Marx and Engels. And this is the quote that all of hauntology comes from, is an application of this. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe has entered into holy alliance to exercise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. The ghost of the past that then continues to spook, disturb, and disrupt the present, we would describe as the field of hauntology. From the perspective of this research, hauntology is considered a cultural analysis whereby the unfulfilled ambitions of the past are repeated as an attempt to escape from the present. And this was first articulated by Derrida, who based the concept on the aforementioned quote by Marx. And this is what Derrida has to say. Capitalist societies can always heave a sigh of relief and say to themselves, communism is finished. Since the collapse of totalitarianism of the 20th century, and not only is it finished, but it did not take place. It was only a ghost. They do no more than disavow the undeniable itself. A ghost never dies. It remains to come back, to come and to come back. And so for Derrida, there was potential to engage with the spectre of communism or of past culture more broadly as a way to understand how previous ideas of society informed, affected, intersected, etc., with current ones. He argued that capitalism, with its focus on accelerating ever faster, falsely believed that it could outrun the past. But like a ghost, the past would continue to haunt places, spaces, and time, no matter how much change occurred. And so, as I sort of briefly mentioned earlier, Derrida employed the analogy of the apparition of Hamlet's father, a symbol for the ghost of communism continuing to haunt Europe. Understanding the world as containing ghosts of the past which reappear and unrequited visions of the future that linger informs sort of this much larger field of cultural and artistic analysis beyond Derrida's original scope. Theorists such as Mark Fisher and Merlin Coverley have greatly expanded the field. And at this point, hauntology has become sort of a heterogeneous method of research employed to articulate anything that seems to arise and linger from an alternative temporality to the present. Hauntology often employs a variety of cultural and artistic symbols to provide evidence of this lingering, haunting sensation. While Derrida examined temporality in its relation to capitalism's treatment of communism, Fisher observed that postmodern forms of music are often haunted by retrophantasms, which bring with them recycled trends, nostalgia dreams, and dreams of this future that never occurred. Even theorists in ethnography have been applying notions of ghosts to find what sees beyond the boundaries of actually spoken language and direct human connection or contact to interplay between space, place, objects, and temporality. Coverley notes that hauntology is nebulous and cyclical, challenging presumptions that we interpret and understand time as linear. So if we locate ourselves in a digital world, a space of postmodernism, post-photography, post-documentary, etc. And amongst that genres, post-rock, post-rap, and so on, then the current era can be understood as sort of having lingering haunting of these pre-existing ideas. Postmodernism is not the end of modernism because we're still referencing the modern. The ghost of it continues to kind of intersect with what has come next. And that leads us to the concept of the Necker cube. So Delaney, the author of Dahlgren, claims that his novel uses a concept that he calls multi-stable perception. And to define that really simply is that that's a piece of art that works from multiple perspectives, but can only be interpreted one at a time. And the Necker cube is kind of a visual piece of symbology for this. The idea is that if we look at this cube in front of us, we can see a cube with its front face in the southwesterly direction or in the northeasterly direction, but not at the same time. We are forced to see one at a time, with neither being more correct than the other. And perhaps this will make it a little clearer here. So multi-stable perception is also known as bistable perception. They're interchangeable. But multi-stable perception is a perceptual phenomenon in which an observer experiences an unpredictable sequence of spontaneous subjective changes. And while this is traditionally associated with visual perception, typically in the form of optical illusion, multi-stable perception can also be experienced auditorially and olfactorily. Relating this to hauntology, perhaps we can see how spatiotemporality in the present might be shifted to engage with the past or future selectively. Expanding on this, however, is my proposal that regardless of the illusion, the Necker cube is still itself drawn on a singular plane. These lines are flat or on a piece of paper or on a screen in this instance. And so thus, it is still in fact happening simultaneously. And this is where I draw the introduction of the plane of eminence. So as I mentioned earlier, I am going to attempt to cover the plane of eminence in an efficient way for what we're doing. If people have questions at the end specifically about this, I'm more than happy to try and tackle them. This is a very difficult idea. So in the philosophical tradition, the context of immanence directly contrasts with transcendence. Transcendence refers to something that exists beyond or outside of a limit, beyond what can be thought or understood. In contrast, immanence is what remains within itself. What lies outside escapes it. Following Kant, immanence does not oppose the transcendental, but rather transcendence. The transcendental is an intensity in the body, a surface mixing the inside and the outside. Therefore, immanence is not interiority, and transcendence as exteriority doesn't fit this thought. It's a plane that unfolds infinitely, crossing everything as a surface, including life's folds. Deleuze's immanence suggests that thought and existence aren't subject to transcendence or external superiority, like that of the transcendent God in classical theology, but instead develops within a relational plane without need for an external entity to impose a limit. Immanent power enables thought to move without needing transcendent direction or origin. And Deleuze calls this image of thought, not idea of thought, since the latter implies transcendence. An image has a sensitive surface, a carnal and vibrating quality, distinguishing itself from ideas. This doesn't mean that ideas are discarded. They are like transcendence, outside the plane of thought, marking a limit. Deleuze's immanence roots back to Spinoza, who conceived it as an infinite, immanent substance, which is what he called God. But this God is far more complex than mere transcendence, and it's an image of thought. Spinoza rejects the separation between the finite and the infinite, emphasizing a single substance that unfolds in various forms or modes. His thought follows a geometrical method, evident in his work, and his ethics sort of related to this. I'll just read a quote here. Ethics demonstrated according to the geometric order. Right? And so Deleuze takes this influence and extends it to the geometric concept of the plane, in the plane of immanence. And this is not a concrete object or a bounded space, but a continuous opening to the unfolding of intensities, an infinite surface where relationships fold and unfold. The concept of plane and immanence in French have subtleties that kind of escape other languages. In French, this actually refers to both a physical plane and a strategic or navigational plan. Thus, what Deleuze is referring to is not simply a static spatial structure, but one that allows infinite navigation of thought. We might think of it as a flyover. And this notion of flyover doesn't imply kind of a singular static kind of God like overlooking gaze, but rather a movement that is constantly searching, a flight low over the battlefield, aware of the imperceptible intensities and signs of life emerging from chaos. Therefore, the plane of eminence should not be quickly understood as physical or geographical, but as a dynamic relation of forces, intensities, and thought movements. It is an opening to the virtual, what is not yet actualized, but contains real potentialities. Similarly, and sort of expanding upon this, the plane of eminence is sort of inaugurated within the concept, that which is created, but is clearly distinct from the concept because it expresses the uncreated, that which thought just does. The plane of eminence thus expresses the non-conceptual that is both internal to and outside the concept. Deleuze and Guattari characterize this complex and almost paradoxical relationship as follows. Concepts are events, but the plane is the horizon of events, the reservoir or reserve of purely conceptual events. And to provide an example, I'm just going to read this quote by Ian Mackenzie, which sort of delves into this in more detail. The present happens because there is a past becoming future horizon. Don't worry, I will try and explain that idea. The present happens because there is a past becoming future horizon presupposed within it. Without a presupposed limitless expanse of time, we could not talk about the present. In the same way, without the presupposed plane of immanence, concepts would never happen. Moreover, as the present would never change without the existence of an eternal horizon presupposed within it, without the institution of the plane, that which thought just does, concepts would never change. The fact that concepts institute this unthinkable plane at their core engenders the movement of concepts, their history, and becoming. And so I'll just jump back to that image for you here. So having kind of discussed that, then I'm going to display this image here, which is by Noel, Henry, and Gallagher, which is a really interesting paper on the functions of Deleuze. But they sort of describe here, they attempt to draw the plane of eminence. And I'll just sort of explain their notes on this drawing here. The eternal event horizon is indicated in this figure by the broken line becoming, which bisects past and future. This event horizon field imagines a plane of immanence in and on, which waves past already thoughts, becoming future thinking. Becoming future thinking are emerged through the plane of immanence as concept events. The event horizon on the plane of immanence recognizes before becoming, which is the past, so before becoming already thoughts, as multiple waves rising and falling. The plane of immanence envelops infinite movements that pass back and forth through it, but concepts are the infinite speed of finite movements that pass only through their own components. And they go on to say, I see in this view an analogy with the sun and flares that escape it to become concepts of solar energy that variously affect the bodies of the solar system in ways that we are only beginning to perceive, yet barely understand. Similarly, Jacob Zebnik explains a way to think metaphorically about the relationship between concepts and planes, which I think might be useful for some purposes here. In order to describe the plane of eminence, Deleuze and Guattari must simultaneously describe the concept. The plane of eminence and the concept mutually define one another. It is as if the plane of eminence is an invisible mental landscape that can only be seen through the concepts occupying it. It is a place that becomes noticeable through the objects that occupy this space. It is like cities that appear to an aeroplane flying over dark continents when, after night has fallen, the lights come on. So I understand that was quite heavy in that regard. Let's sort of move to sort of the practical outputs of what has been a very dense sort of theoretical discussion. Firstly, what have I done? I've attempted to document spaces which I think have hauntogenic potential. And I will detail exactly what I mean by that in the following slides. Then I've wanted to use the data of those digital images, of those spaces, as both text and sonified audio to produce visual and auditory artworks. Thirdly, I'd like to explore performing that data as playable sounds responding to the aforementioned formats that I mentioned. And this kind of leads us to this idea of tripartite constructions. So using multiple variations and outputs of the same information, that information being the data and the pictures of these locations, I want to create works which function on three levels. Firstly, that the work rebuilds spaces which exist beyond the pictorial by drawing out the data that resides underneath images. Secondly, the work has an auditory component, which similarly points to that which sits outside of our experience of present spatiotemporality due to the nebulous nature of sound and how we hear. Where does a sound begin and end? Apologies, I'm getting some sort of audio feeding through for me. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what that was. Was that okay? I got a whole bunch of phone ringing and other sounds through my audio and can no longer hear you.
Which phone is this? Okay. I should test the mic. 1, 2. No, everything is fine. Don't worry.
Everything's fine? So sorry, I was getting someone's phone ringing. All good. Sorry about that. Okay. Where was I? Here we go. Lastly, using the playable data from images to respond to works as if they were notation. And that leads to the project itself, which is Agnosis and Black Powder Tongue. And I'll get into more detail as to what we're looking at as we sort of move ahead here. So Gnosis and Black Powder Tongue attempts to kind of examine the trajectory of photography as a tool as part of the language of capitalism in the current age of mass-mediated digital production. Here, the data of digital photographic files is used to produce auditory, written, and disrupted visual artworks which query the forms of depiction that mediate and filter the terrestrial world around us. Taken from landscape photographs of locations and/or, I guess, environments, let's call them, that no longer exist, these empty, hauntogenic spaces are rebuilt with auditory structures. These structures are deployed to consider, reimagine, and recontextualize lost futures, question established interpretations of locations, and reform sites through the lens of digital data. Photography, according to both Walter Benjamin and Byung-Chul Han, who I mentioned earlier, is attached to industrialization at the hip. Its birth and development a form of accelerative capitalist advancement. And unsurprisingly, this also explains its role as a colonial tool, wherein the camera's truth rendered land as terra nullius, which means empty land, unowned, and segmented it for consumption. In our digital context, the photograph's role is increasingly unstable, further siloing and segmenting the self from a connection to spatial temporal experience. Han argues that time widespread digital photography. Ergo, I seek to develop a response akin to Baudrillard's fatal strategies, dismissing the dialectic entirely and producing works which seek to render digital photographs as a malleable reflexive tool against itself. Only in the line of flight produced by total deconstruction, i.e. death or something beyond death, can such an escape to an alternative space occur. This work here specifically is about the Perth Barracks, of which this is a historical image in front of you of, and specifically about a remaining element of it, the Barracks Arch, which you'll see shortly in its current state. Here, this sort of semi-erased structure of colonialism continues to exist. The site was originally built to house what was known as the Enrolled Pensioner Guards, which were basically British troops on their way to retirement were sent to protect convict transports, or basically were sent here to guard slaves. And so then when those soldiers were brought here, they would protect these slaves, and in return were given unceded illegal land from indigenous communities for them to live on. And here is the arch itself. And so in 1996, there was a vote whether we should remove this building entirely, what was left of it, or leave it. And there was sort of much debate about this. And interestingly, the Canberra Times, which is another state, another city here in Australia, said the following: Perth's old barracks archway has become for its defenders the West Coast Arc de Triomphe. For weeks it has teetered forlorn in what seemed to be its last days on the brink of the chasm that will contain the Mitchell Freeway. Now it stands as a symbol for the victory of sentiment over aesthetics and history over progress. Once again, I think touching back to hauntology, this idea of things continuing to exist. And so with this project, I rebuild the barracks as an ongoing structure of hauntogenic colonial violence, combining still and video footage of the location and the data of these digital files, constructing imagery, playable sound tools, noises, etc., composition for improvised music performance. So we had previously the photograph here. This is what it is today. And this is my image. So this is built from the ANSI and ASCII of the data files. It's built from photos of them. It's also built from sound waves of the sonification of the photos of the site as well, and the hexadecimal data. See there. Back to it again. Here again. So a lot of these shapes, like I said, are sound waves which have been recorded and rendered in 3D, laid and spliced, etc. And now I'm going to sort of show a series of sort of examples of both sound and sort of live performance. People can get an idea of what exactly this notation art sound object is. So not all of these will have audio. but this is an example. So this is meant to be played by a single performer or multiple. I myself have done several performances of this now, and as part of the Contemporary Music Week, there will be a laboratory as part of this process in which a number of performers will attempt this as well. And part of this process is that these are separate kind of sections of artworks and compositions, but they're selected randomly. So they're put into a playlist, and the playlist selects and repeats them at choice, cyclically, in the same way we might engage with hauntology. There's an unknown improvised element to this where we're unsure what kinds of images you might get. I've done performances where the same section of video has played 10, 15 times in a row. I've done others where I've never seen the same section twice. And this kind of leads us to a question, right, is how exactly do we kind of define notation? And this is very, very broad. But for the purposes of this research, perhaps let's start somewhere really simple. These notation art sound objects, kind of all the aesthetics and sounds you've heard so far today, include a system, let's call it, of marks, figures, and symbols. And that can be both literally, computationally, these are data files, and interpretationally. They are symbols that kind of provide with us a shorthand of interpretation. These then potentially, via the experience of seeing and hearing them, sort of engages us in this kind of novel reinterpretation of a space where typically hidden, literally unseen elements, i.e. we don't see the data traditionally of pictures, may reveal qualities beyond that of sort of chronological history or of pictorial images of the site. Likewise, I propose that these may open spaces as well for notation or composition, not to be purely graphical or interpretive, but also to kind of be documentaries in a strange way, to be direct information from the site. They explore the experience of a space quite literally, really, through their material, even if that is abstracted. And here I might use the term allotropic, which is a scientific term used to describe elements that are made of the same, or things that are made of the same elements, but in differing variations. A very, very basic one might be water and ice, we might think of. And so the works here intertwine allotropic formats of digital images. These images rework spatiotemporality, history, and kind of medium, as in material, into variations which loop, repeat, rework, and continually redefine one another. But let's get into something a little stranger and more abstract, right? What does this kind of mean, the relationship between the compositions and the sounds? What does this mean for us? That the compositions themselves produce sounds and images built from the same information. And so we get into questions sort of then, what are these arbitrary and direct relations these things might have? On one level, it's direct because it's literally from the data. In others, maybe it's slightly perhaps interpretation, like it's to be interpreted or sort of gained through extra musical knowledge that's perhaps slightly arbitrary. And so perhaps in this way, we might kind of see a very abstract and oblique relationship perhaps to programmatic music or program music, wherein kind of music was telling a story that sat outside of the sonics. And this, following from this, I'm going to attempt quite quickly, as I know we don't have a ton of time, to discuss the role of Kant's sublime and this idea of the disquiet and how that kind of might shore up some of these ideas. So for Kant, the sublime is the experience of the feeling of superiority over our own power of reason as a supersensible faculty over nature. Furthermore, the sublime can be described thus. It is an object of nature, and the presentation of which determines the mind to think of nature's inability to attain an exhibition of ideas. Now, anyone who's kind of aware of Kant would kind of know two things about his opinions in the sublime. One, he didn't think art could be sublime, only nature. Two, he also didn't think music was an art form. He was very, very negative of music. So there's a bit of legwork I have to do here to get him to fit. And this is where Van Dennebiel's amazing 2015 paper, which I highly recommend people read, on the matterist and mannerist sublime, does a lot of the heavy lifting here. So broadly speaking, Van Dennebiel's matterist and mannerist sublime repurpose Kant's mathematical sublime to be usable to assess new, often non-traditional modes of artistic expression. The matter of sublime is about the matter of things, and is about a lack of aesthetic consideration, which then allows for a prioritization of concepts. So we experience the sublime because there is no subject to our art. We go, oh, it's all conceptual. There's no visual. It's too overwhelming for me to get the idea. Inversely, the manner of sublime is about excessive aestheticization, or when technique is prioritized over the subject of the artwork. So that's when the aesthetics are so strong, there is such a specific, exaggerated style to the artist or musician's work that the concept is kind of swallowed whole, pulled apart. And so I think some of the things I've shown today are kind of simultaneously playing with this. Sometimes it's so data-driven, so conceptual, so lacking in a style, perhaps, that we lose sense of it. And inversely, sometimes it is so abstracted, arbitrary, aesthetically driven, that perhaps we lose sense of the concept. And Kant compares this experience to a vibration, i.e. to a rapidly alternating repulsion from an attraction to one and the same object. And I connect this with hauntology. I would relate this to the known and the unknown, the terrestrially understood and the ghostly. You know, the idea of something that is non-musical becoming musical, the something that is sound or data turning into something visual, and so on. And Van Dennenbiel sort of engages in the same ideas. He talks about that if the artist's imagination goes beyond the bounds of experience, that the artwork forces the viewer to have difficulty with grasping and comprehending the aesthetic idea. We clearly no longer find ourselves in the domain of beauty, at least as which Kant understood it. And instead, we are grappling with an excess of images and meanings through which the power of imagination needs to excel itself. This process of desiring reason and understanding in the face of seemingly insurmountable complexity causes shock and recoils the imagination. And this leads to what Kant describes as an abyss in which imagination is afraid to lose itself, which I think is what we're sort of playing with here. So how does this relate to this idea of the disquiet, which I propose? This quote, I'm not going to read it out loud, it's from the Invisible Committee. This was sort of a thing about contemporary politics. I think it's sort of worth sitting and living in this kind of world because this is where this work exists. But in this sense where things become, they vibrate, they oscillate, they become from non-sound to sound. They go from quiet to this disquiet, that which now is producing loud noise. In this sort of supposed post-photographic, postmodernist period of time, wherein unrequited visions of the future intersect with present lived experience, the role of the camera as a tool for understanding history and stabilization is ruptured, and disquiet then arises. This sense of disquiet I sort of extend out of a lineage of 20th century concerns surrounding how the self and other intersect. Mark Fisher, in his text The Weird and the Eerie, proposed that art and media in the 20th century was preoccupied with some sensations of either the weird or the eerie. And these are not sort of to do with horror, but more with kind of this fascination for the outside, the other. The weird is a sensation of wrongness. It's when our understanding of the world is inadequate, and so the object in question is now considered weird. Fisher provides two examples, vampires and black holes, right? You know, he sort of provides this comparison where he says the vampire is fantastical, it lacks strangeness, it's mythology, but the black hole is sort of equally as mysterious, destructive, but is a part of our world. It sits in our world, but we can't explain it. In contrast, we have the, you know, sorry, one second. We had the weird, then we got the eerie. The eerie is when we expect something to be there, but it no longer exists. So that may be a city which is missing, a place demolished, so on. You know, it's a failure of absence or a failure of presence is how they divide the two. To wrap up very quickly, because I've just sort of seen that here. I'll skip this bit. I'm happy to kind of talk more about that. I'll very briefly show some examples of the. So this is sort of one setup of the exhibition that we've done. This works. further examples of some of the sections of composition. And that sort of gives some examples of the work. And I'll wrap up at that point there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Now we're going to move forward to the questions. Do we have any questions for Jacob?
Hi, Jacob. It's Sean here. How you going?
Oh, hi, Sean. Yeah, good. How you going?
Good, good. We're sitting here sort of responding quite nicely to your articulation of the sublime in response to 21st century experience. Wondering if you have any experiences that you can reflect on or describe with that might sit at either ends of that spectrum, or perhaps more intriguingly in the point of oscillation with other works or experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of other works, yeah, in that sort of oscillation period, I think there's a lot of noise projects I can think of that very much engage with that. Sorry, I'm getting feedback of my own talking. It's quite hard to. Thank you. There's a lot of noise works that I think engage with that. That kind of oscillation between there and the other. I think, a lot of projects by like Uboa, Merzbow, and things kind of engage in that strain space where you sort of comprehend something and then you lose it very quickly. You have a sense of self and of data, and you go, oh, that's what this is talking about, and then it kind of disappears, fades, transforms into something incomprehensible. The bit I didn't quite get to touch on, which I think is important to this, what you talk about in between, when I talk about the disquiet, is if the weird and the eerie of the 20th century, that kind of fall in this sublime experience, are about the other. I think really importantly to me, the disquiet is about the self. So if these both other qualities are about something we expect or don't expect, but is an outside of us, it's about our interpretation of the world. To me, the disquiet is about the loss of our interpretation of ourselves in this context. So, we could even very simply relate that to how we depict and sort of live ourselves virtually compared to ourselves in person. An example, it's a bit abstract, but I definitely think one I've experienced. If you've ever been to like a major city and there's been thousands of people somewhere really busy, that can have a similar experience of kind of that overwhelming sense of the loss of self and context.
We have another question? Request. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations from the floor.
Welcome again. We're gonna start now with Dr. Jaco Meyer. So Jaco, welcome. You are ready to start.
Thank you very much. Transcription has long formed part of compositional and performance practice, serving a range of functions across historical and contemporary contexts. Composers and musicians transcribe music for reasons that include accessibility, practicality, technical feasibility, educational value, expansion of repertoire, performance context, economic considerations, artistic exploration, adaptation to available resources, and preservation and dissemination. These motivations demonstrate that transcription is an established practice within music making. Transcriptions can be made between any combination of instruments. However, this study adopts a pragmatic focus on transcriptions between the violin, the viola, cello, and double bass. This focus is motivated by the structural and technical relationships within this group. These instruments share similar construction principles, bowing techniques, and tuning systems, which contribute to a relatively homogeneous tone color across the family. At the same time, they also have important differences in open string configuration, register size, fingering systems, and resonance. These differences significantly influence performance technique and execution on each of the instruments. Let us begin by listening to a well-known prelude of J.S. Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major, performed on the cello. This will be followed by two versions of the same work on the double bass. In the first version, the music is transposed into a higher register so that it sounds at approximately the same pitch as the cello. In the second version, it is performed in a much lower register, closer to the natural range of the double bass. Even from these brief examples, it becomes apparent that transcription involves more than simply transferring notes from one instrument to another. The choices made during the transcription process can have a significant impact on the resulting musical outcome. Here is the original version for cello. Here is the first transcription performed in a higher register. And then lastly, a simulated version in the lower register for the double bass. Although these instruments differ in technical aspects, transcription between these instruments within the string family is often approached in a superficial or mechanical manner. A common method involves simple procedures such as changing the clef or transposing material by a fixed interval, typically a perfect fifth or an octave. In practice, this is usually accompanied by limited adjustments to ensure technical feasibility, such as checking double stops, harmonics, and range. While these approaches may produce playable results, they tend to prioritize efficiency over deeper musical engagement. This tendency aligns with observations in the literature, where aspects such as range, chordal adaptation, and register placement are frequently identified as primary concerns in transcription practice. The literature on transcription emphasizes that such approaches are insufficient for achieving idiomatic and musically convincing results. Idiomatic writing is defined as a style that is appropriate to a specific instrument, taking into account its technical capabilities, sonorous qualities, and limitations. Huron and Berek refined this by suggesting that idiomatic solutions are those that achieve musical goals with relative ease on a given instrument. This implies that transcription requires more than a mere transposition of pitches, and that it involves rethinking how musical material is realized in relation to the affordances of the instrument the transcription is made for. Harjo writes that the intricacies of the instrument for which the transcription is made should be well understood by the composer in order to create idiomatic transcriptions. Successful transcription requires a thorough understanding of both the source and target instruments, as well as familiarity with the existing transcriptions and instrumental techniques. Without such understanding, transcription risks becoming ineffective or unidiomatic. It is also possible that certain works may resist transcription altogether, particularly when they are strongly associated with the identity and characteristics of a specific instrument. As a composer and music analyst myself, I became increasingly aware that transcription is widely practiced and often treated as a straightforward technical process that frequently overlooks deeper compositional and conceptual aspects. The prevailing reliance on mechanical procedures, such as the intervallic transposition or clef substitution, reflects a limited engagement with the idiomatic and technical demands of the target instrument. This is particularly problematic in compositions that are conceptually driven. Therefore, this study argues that technical adjustments, such as the transposition and feasibility checks, are not sufficient when creating transcriptions of works that are conceptually driven. In such cases, transcription requires analytical engagement with the compositional process and may involve reinterpretation or even recomposition in order to preserve the integrity of the work. This study adopts an artistic research approach in which creative practice functions as a primary means of inquiry. Artistic research is characterized by its focus on the creative process as both method and site of investigation. As Borgdorf et al. Note, in artistic research, creating performances or artifacts become the vehicle in a methodological sense through which knowledge and understanding can be gained. This approach acknowledges that aspects of artistic knowledge are tacit and arise through the processes of making and reflection. In this context, the act of musical transcription is treated as a form of critical artistic practice through which instrument-specific possibilities and limitations can be explored. This study centers on one of my own compositions entitled A Portfolio of Mirrors, originally written for solo violoncello. The research proceeds through the creation of transcriptions of the work for violin, viola, and contrabass by myself as composer. These transcriptions are treated as processes that require engagement with the original material and compositional processes, rather than superficial transfers. The study therefore involves the iterative development of multiple versions of the work, including instances where transcription gives way to recomposition in order to account for instrument-specific characteristics and to reflect the conceptual basis of the original composition. Through this process, the study demonstrates how a composition can be constructed in a way that resists superficial transcription. In such cases, transcription cannot rely on technical adaptation alone, but requires engagement with the conceptual properties of the work, which may, in some instances, necessitate recomposition. The example that follows demonstrates that transcription involves at least three interrelated considerations: practical, sonic, and conceptual. Practical considerations concern playability and instrumental feasibility. Sonic considerations concern the resulting timbre, register, and resonance. And conceptual considerations concern the underlying compositional principles on which the work is based. While all three are important, this study prioritizes the preservation of conceptual relationships with practical and sonic adaptations made in service of that goal. A portfolio of mirrors is a composition for solo cello that explores the idea of reflection as a generative compositional principle. The use of reflection as a compositional device has a long history and can be found in the works of composers such as Anton Webern, where inversional and symmetrical relationships often play important structural roles. Drawing on my own interests in symmetry, asymmetry, and transformational processes such as inversion, retrograde, and palindromic structures, I treated musical material as something that can be reflected, displaced, and recontextualized across different domains. The composition engages with multiple forms of reflection that operate across pitch, register, notation, and instrumental layout, allowing patterns to reappear in transformed states. In this way, the work establishes a framework in which musical ideas are interconnected through processes of reflection. Instead of following the original order, I will present the movements in a sequence that better shows the ideas I want to focus on. The order here will be mirror 4, mirror 1, mirror 2, and mirror 3. Let me begin with mirror 4 and outline this movement. The mirror in this movement is conceptualized along the strings of the cello themselves. The 4 strings are treated as two pairs with a symmetrical axis running between the middle strings. Material played on the upper strings is reflected onto the lower strings, so that fingered positions and pitched relationships are mirrored across this axis. In practice, this means that gestures on one side of the instrument are reproduced on the opposite side, resulting in corresponding pitch transformations that follow the physical layout of the strings. The mirror is therefore not located in the notation, but in the instrument itself. Therefore, the compositional process is directly tied to the spatial and technical properties of the cello, as shown in this example, where the notation is coupled with the strings of the cello. Here is also a recording of the movement for cello. transcribing this movement for other string instruments, careful consideration must be given to the spatial and technical properties of the target instrument. The viola is the only instrument within the string family that shares the same string structure as the cello, with strings tuned C, G, D, and A. It is therefore possible to transpose the material an octave higher and notate it in the alto clef when adapting the work for viola. It represents a relatively straightforward approach that is often employed in transcriptions from cello to viola. From a technical perspective, the double stops can become slightly more demanding, but remain playable on the viola at the tempo of the movement. A very similar approach can be followed when transcribing the movement for violin. In order to preserve the conceptual framework of the original, the material must be transposed by an octave and a perfect fifth, with notation in the treble clef. This adjustment reflects the different string configuration of the violin, which is G, D, A, and E, which imposes constraints on how the material can be mapped onto the instrument while maintaining the original spatial relationships. Here is a recording, or a snippet of recording of this movement made for the viola. Shown here is the transposition for the violin with the G, D, A, E strings. When we consider the case of the double bass, it presents some complexities. At first glance, it may seem possible to transpose the material up by a major third, but this approach requires additional considerations. Ideally, the transcription should be realized on a 4-string double bass without a C extension, in order to remain consistent with the 4-string conceptual framework of the cello. More significantly, whereas the open strings of the violin, viola, and cello are tuned in perfect fifths, the strings of the cello, or the double bass, are tuned in perfect fourths. As a result, direct intervallic transpositions alone is no longer sufficient. Where it is possible to preserve the physical, spatial interaction of the work, which forms the central conceptual aspect of the movement, the resulting pitches necessarily differ. Such a transcription would look as shown here. One could, of course, alter the intervallic content of the material, but this is not strictly necessary. While what is essential is an awareness that the string structures differ, and that the pitches must be adapted in order to preserve the conceptual basis of the original composition. In the case of the double bass, the intervals within the diads become compressed, resulting in a denser sonority, particularly as the instrument sounds an octave lower than written. At this point, the transcription process moves beyond straightforward transposition and requires a series of compositional decisions. The first question is whether the priority should be given to preserving the exact pitches of the original, preserving the physical actions of the performer, or preserving the conceptual mirror on which the movement is based. In my own transcription, I chose to prioritize the conceptual framework. This meant that the physical transcription relationships between the strings and finger placements were retained, even when this resulted in different pitch content from the original cello version. A second consideration concerned the resulting sonority. Because the intervals become compressed on the double bass, Some dyads produce a much denser texture than in the cello version. Rather than treating this as a problem to be eliminated, I regarded this as a consequence of transferring the concept to a different instrument. The challenge therefore became finding a balance between preserving the conceptual integrity of the movement and producing a musically convincing result on the double bass. These decisions illustrate that the transcription process is not merely technical. The transcriber must determine which aspects of the original work are essential and which aspects must be adapted. In this case, the conceptual mirror was regarded as the primary compositional feature, and the remaining musical material was adjusted accordingly. In mirror 1, the next movement, the third line of the stave functions as the conceptual mirror axis. Notes are therefore reflected in relation to the central line of the stave, so that their positions on the staff are inverted across it. For instance, a note on the lowest line corresponds to a note on the highest line, while notes in the lower spaces are matched by notes in the upper spaces. Notes that lie on the middle line itself remain unchanged and may be repeated. In addition to this spatial inversion, accidentals are also reflected, such that sharps correspond to flats and vice versa. These reflections do not occur immediately, but may appear at different points in the score, provided that each note is ultimately paired with a corresponding reflection. As a result, the movement operates as a kind of musical puzzle, in which interdependent elements are distributed across the texture and must be understood in relation to one another. To provide oral support for the structural relationships, corresponding reflections are articulated using similar performance techniques, such as sul ponticello passages, forming reflective pairs. Here is a recording of the movement for cello. When the material is transferred to the violin or viola and notated in the treble or alto clef, the resulting pitch content changes completely. Consider the following example, where the same notation in alto clef produces a different pitch outcome. This is also the case when the material is transposed an octave higher. The following example illustrates how identical notation in alto clef results in different pitch realizations. Here is a recording made for the viola. This leaves the informed transcriber with two possible approaches, either to retain the spatial configuration of the pitch material and superimpose it onto a different clef, or to recompose the work fragment by fragment. In the first case, however, the resulting material is effectively determined by the notational system rather than by compositional intent, which limits the composer's control. As a result, the pitch relationships may lack coherence and, in some instances, produce material that falls outside the playable range of the viola, shown in the third note already. When the second approach is followed, it requires a thorough analysis of the work and its underlying conceptual framework before recomposition can take place. As mentioned earlier, this work can be understood as a puzzle in which the components are fitted together. In the context of transcription and recomposition, however, it functions more like a system of interdependent mechanisms where a change in one part has consequences elsewhere. It may therefore be necessary to adjust material both forwards and backwards in order to achieve structural and pitch coherence. In my transcription for viola, I adopted the second approach, and the result can be seen in this example. As can be seen in this example, it was necessary to extend the original compositional framework by introducing double flats and double sharps, with natural signs used to adjust the pitch relationships more precisely. In addition, the earlier constraints of repeating notes on the middle line was not strictly maintained. These notes were altered in order to allow the reflective processes to continue consistently. Later in the movement, the Cs on the middle line were further varied through alternation between C flat and C sharp, introducing greater differentiation within this structural position. Mirror 2 is loosely inspired by a rondo form and is based on the application of set theoretical principles. Pitch class sets were organized on circular clock face diagrams, where mirroring axes were established between pitch classes. These axes determine how pitch material is reflected, with corresponding pitch classes mapped onto opposite points of the circle. Here are two examples from the musical gestures that open the first two segments. When the pitch classes of these gestures are mapped on a clock face diagram, it becomes clear that the material is derived from two pitch class sets that reflect one another, shown by the diagonal line indicating the mirror of the two sets, and each set color-coded either blue or purple. Here is a recording of the movement for cello. I'll take it up to there. The compositional process, therefore derives its pitch content from these reflected relationships, resulting in systematic transformations of the original material. The two examples shown are derived from the same two pitch class sets, but the material is permutated. This movement does not present significant challenges when transcribed for other instruments, as the conceptual mirror is located within the set theoretical clock phases rather than aspects related to the instrument. Possible transcriptions of the material due to the transcription process results in rotation of the clock phase with the mirror axis rotating accordingly while remaining fixed in relation to the set. The third and last movement, Mirror 3, functions as an intermezzo and begins with a short thematic idea. The pitch classes of this theme are subsequently used to generate a series of variations in which the material is transformed through different registers, playing techniques, and textures, at times creating contrapuntal interactions. The recurring pitch material is thus redistributed across the movement and can be understood as a form of reflection that operates through variation and recontextualization rather than direct inversion. Here's a recording of the movement for solo cello. In this movement, the notion of reflection is not located in the instrument, the staff, or the pitch material itself, but rather in the structural layout of the composition. As a result, the transcriber is afforded greater flexibility in adapting the movement for other instruments, as the underlying concept does not depend on fixed spatial or instrumental relationships. This study has shown that transcription, particularly in conceptually driven work, cannot be reduced to a set of technical procedures, such as transposition or clef substitution. Through the transcription of a portfolio of mirrors, it became evident that the nature and location of the underlying compositional concept determine the extent to which a work can be transferred between instruments. In some cases, relatively straightforward adaptation is possible, while in others, transcription requires analytical engagement and may extend into recomposition. From an artistic research perspective, this process demonstrates how creative practice can function as a means of generating knowledge about instrumental writing and compositional thinking. I therefore argue for an understanding of transcription as an active and reflective compositional practice, rather than a purely technical task. This does not suggest that one must be a composer in order to engage in transcription, nor is it intended as a critique of pragmatic transcription practices. Rather, it aims to draw attention to the possibility of a deeper compositional engagement, particularly from a composer's perspective, that may be overlooked when transcription is approached without sufficient care and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to continue with the questions. We have any question? Yes?
Hi, Jaco. This is Damien from Melbourne. I'm sitting here with Sean. Congratulations to you for a wonderful lecture. I've got fond memories about the Johann Sebastian Bach piece you opened with as it was transcribed and prepared for performance on electric bass guitar. And so I wonder, with your experience, if you have any comments, observations or judgments even about transcription and preparation of such compositions for electric instruments.
I don't have much experience with that, but I think one would have very similar challenges, especially if you're looking at something like a bass guitar, for example. I can only imagine that the challenges will be very similar to what you have for the double bass, is that you're not just simply going to make the lowest G on the bass guitar your foundational note, if I can call it that, like you would do with a cello. I suspect that it's more likely that someone is going to transpose it an octave higher to work on the bass guitar, for example. And again, the sonority challenges that you have when working with an electric guitar, for example, if you get to a point where the notes just simply start to smudge because of the electrical sounds interfering, I think one has to make, different changes to the music.
Thank you.
Great. We have other questions? Maybe?
Just a thank you and congratulations from Sean. That was a very clear and beautifully presented talk.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, we're going to conclude now the lecture. Congratulations again, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. We're going to have now Gabriel Lucian's lecture. Welcome, Gabriel.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, my name is Gabriel Lucian Roman. I'm a guitarist from Romania, and I recently completed the master's degree at the PTO School of Music in Sweden. As a performer, I often found myself making musical decisions based on sound, texture, and instrumental response rather than pitch, pitch and rhythm alone. Over time, this led me to ask how these aspects might contribute to the formation and perception of musical phrases. The project is titled Multi-modal Analytical Approaches in Modern Guitar Phrasing, and it explores how elements from morphosyntactic analysis and spectromorphology can contribute to a richer understanding of contemporary electric guitar phrasing. And here we go. Before getting into the analytical framework, I'd like to begin with a broader idea that gradually emerged throughout this project. As the research developed, I became increasingly interested in the way musical phrasing can be understood through the interaction of multiple dimensions, rather than through a single analytical perspective. Throughout today's lecture, I will focus on three recurring concepts: resonance, density, and identity, which emerged repeatedly during the analytical process and eventually became central to the way I approach the material. These concepts will serve as entry points into different aspects of guitar phrasing and will guide us from sound to structure. As a guitarist, particularly in popular music genres and improvised-based context, I often found that many important aspects of phrasing emerge through performance. Gestural articulations, timbral inflections, and the idiomatic capacities of the instrument frequently contribute to the shaping of musical material and influence the way phrases are articulated and perceived. After a while, this led me to become increasingly interested in the relationship between sound and structure, and the possibility that timbre and gesture might play a more significant role in phrase formation than is often acknowledged in traditional analytical approaches. The search for analytical tools capable of addressing these dimensions eventually became one of the starting points of this research. So the employed analytical framework brings into dialogue morphosyntactic analysis and spectromorphology through a shared interest in timbre. Among guitarists, timbre is often approached through the broader notion of tone. Tone encompasses sonic characteristics, technical and gestural actions, the idiomatic capacities of the instrument, signal chain decisions, and the wide range of artistic choices made throughout the performance process. Understanding timbre from this perspective provided a common ground through which morphosyntactic and spectromorphological perspectives could be explored within the same research context. Before moving to the detailed analysis, I would like to briefly clarify a few analytical units and aspects of notation that might otherwise create confusion. At the most basic level, the analysis is built on tone events, understood as individual sound events as they are articulated on the instrument. These are shaped through gestural articulation, referred to here as idiomatic markers, including techniques such as bends, vibrato, or hammer-ons. At the same time, the analysis takes into account how sound evolves after the initial attack, so the evolution of sound in time, to what I describe as spectral transition. At a higher level, the structure is articulated through contextual nodes, which mark significant points such as beginnings, internal transitions, and closures. It is important to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. A tone event can also function as an idiomatic marker and as a spectral transition simultaneously. However, idiomatic markers and spectral transitions are only identified in the analysis when they carry structural or perceptual significance or meaning. Otherwise, a tone event may simply remain a tone event without additional analytical attribution. In addition, motivic material appears in different variants, indicated through a simple notation such as x, x prime, x second, x degree, and so on. The initial unit labeled x represents the original material. Variants such as x prime or x second indicate transformations of this material where the degree of variation depends on how far the new instance departs from the original. For instance, in x prime, the variation is minimal, while in further variants, the transformation becomes more pronounced, introducing increasingly distinct features in terms of sound and articulation. When a unit no longer maintains a meaningful relationship with the original material, it is identified as a new unit and labeled with a different letter, for example, y. For reasons of clarity and time also, I will not go into the full system of notation used in the analysis, such as the detailed labeling of phrases, cells, or their variants. These aspects will be introduced progressively in direct connection with the musical examples. The focus here is on how these analytical units operate in sound rather than on notation itself. Jumping into the analysis, we will just have a short audition before each analytical example. Here we are talking about the first day or day one, named At the Age of Silence. This segment is built around the idea of resonance. Rather than presenting a theme immediately, the music begins by exploring the acoustic possibilities of the instrument. Tones, open strings, and sympathetic vibrations gradually create a sonic environment from which the musical material can emerge. So what we heard now, it was the complete day one section. For the analysis, I will now look at the opening and the theme separately. This allows us to better understand the structure of the section and to isolate some of its characteristic features. Jumping into the opening, we'll go through the analysis. And this opening segment forms, we can observe that this opening segment forms a complete musical period organized around these contextual nodes, 3 at number. If you will look at the analytical layers here, basically everything that I'm presenting, it should be findable there, and you'll be guided by me. So these nodes articulate the beginning, the internal transition, and the closure of the segment. Talking about the contextual nodes, right? At the syntactic level, the period is structured through an antecedent phrase, a median phrase, and a consequent phrase. Let's see how that sounds. Here we reach the end of the antecedent phrase. The phrase establishes a stable harmonic field through a grouping of finger-picked tone events, creating a sustained texture centered around A. Its closure is articulated by a motivic cell containing tail and vibrato gestures. In the analysis, these function simultaneously as idiomatic markers and spectral transitions, extending resonance beyond the initial attack. Here we enter the median phrase. Activity increases through the interaction of motivic cells and tone event sequences. Forceful pluck articulations create a denser morphosyntactic field, while spectral transitions begin to accumulate. This process leads to the bending gesture, which functions as the climactic point of the period. Let's give it a listen. The consequent phrase reduces the accumulated tension through 2 motivic phrases. This leads to the final contextual node. Here, the same event functions simultaneously as a contextual node, an idiomatic marker, and a spectral transition, as we can see over here. At the syntactic level, it articulates the closure of the period while maintaining an open harmonic field. At this point, before going further, it is important to briefly clarify how to read the spectrogram. So color represents the intensity of spectral energy, which means how strong or pronounced the sound is at a given moment. Brighter colors indicate higher energy, so the sound is more present and clearly articulated, while darker tones indicate lower energy. At the same time, the shape of the traces reflects the mode of articulation, whether the sound is produced through a clear attack or sustained. So having this in mind, in the first image, so ST1, spectral transition 1, corresponds to a discrete onset where the energy is concentrated in a short vertical trace followed by minimal sustain. This indicates a rapid decay and a low level of spectral activity. The second spectral transition, or ST2, is characterized by extended horizontal bands in the lower register, indicating sustained resonance. The slight periodic deformation reflects vibrato, corresponding to the action of an idiomatic marker. The third square here, it's a cluster. Is the median cluster in one of the median phrases that we observed in Elan right before. And the compression of successive onsets and the increase in intensity indicate an accumulation of spectral energy. I think this is quite visible in the image as well. And the fourth one, onset is followed by stable horizontal bands and gradual attenuation. So this is a spectrum transition that functions both as a contextual node, announcing the closure of the segment, and an idiomatic marker. These examples show how spectral transitions correspond to the structural articulation observed in the analysis. The theme continues the same sonic environment, but the material becomes more clearly organized. At the same time, we can observe the emergence of a more defined harmonic framework based on quartal structures. These contribute to a sense of tonal orientation while maintaining a certain degree of ambiguity. So before I play it, we have a few things to notice. The theme extends the sonic environment established in the opening, but introduces a clearer internal organization. As we can see in the analysis, the segment is structured into two periods. We will see at least, but it's also visible in the video here. At the phrase level, the material is organized through antecedent, median, consequent, and consequent functions. So we have a median consequent and the consequent phrase, basically. At the same time, the internal organization is defined by the interaction of the motivic units alpha and beta and their transformations. All phrases are introduced again by contextual nodes marked by the chimes in this case. That was the chime. Here we reach the end of the antecedent phrase in period A. The phrase is articulated through the recurrence of alpha and the sequence of related motivic cells belonging to the X cell series. Although the material varies slightly, the recurring gestural profile allows these units to be perceived as part of the same morphological group. The contextual node marks the transition toward the following phrase. And here we go. So if we have to jump into the period B, the antecedent phrase of period B returns with the same general motivic configuration centered on alpha. This creates continuity with period A while preparing further transformation of the material. Then in the following median consequent phrase, beta reappears in a more transformed form, labeled beta double prime, or second. At the same time, the X series continues to evolve through successive variants. Rather than introducing entirely new material, the phrase develops previously established units through incremental transformation. So it's basically variations on theme, the classic variations of theme form. moving forward, day 2 density. Here the theme is structured within a clearly defined rhythmic pattern, which makes the phrase organization more immediately perceptible. At the same time, the material is based on succession of quartal harmonic structures. So one theme is followed by the true theme, which is basically the same material recycled and reorganized in a different different way, both in terms of structure and in terms of harmonic organization or discourse. So the opening of the theme introduces motivic cells X and Y, visible over here. Both of quartal harmonic structures at different pitch levels. Together, they establish the characteristic harmonic language of the theme. Next, we encounter the motivic cell Z. Unlike X and Y, which are articulated as discrete attacks, Z extends the material through continued finger picking. This creates a longer gesture and contributes to the continuity of the phrase. Yes. At this point, the consequent phrase completes the first statement of the thematic period. The material remains unchanged, reinforcing the stability of the harmonic framework. So the main transformation occurs in motivic cell Z prime, which reappears at the end of the consequent phrase. While maintaining the same structural function as Z, it is differentiated through its pitch content. So it's the same thing at a different pitch, to be more precise. And the consequent phrase concludes the second statement of the theme. Once again, the material is presented within minimal variation, emphasizing repetition and structural stability. This thematic unit establishes the harmonic framework for the later sections of day 2. Through the repetition of the antecedent consequent structure and the recurrence of motivic cells X, Y, Z, and Z prime, in this case, the theme maintains tonal ambiguity while providing a stable foundation for the subsequent solo material. So talking about quartal harmonic structures or quartal voicings, if the analytical framework allows us to observe how the thematic material is organized and transformed, the score reveals another important aspect of the relationship between these 2 days. The upper system belongs to day 1, while the bottom 2 systems present the theme from day 2. It's also easily recognizable as day 1. They have these squares placed at the end of the line, end of the notation systems, while in day 2 is in the first bar, the last 2 systems, last 2 lines. Although the harmonic language already exhibits an open and suspended character, points of closure remain present within the phrase structure. In the day 2 theme, however, quartal voicings are no longer directed toward tertian points of resolution. So we can see here the resolution points, which are just here and in the day 2 theme, there is no point of resolution whatsoever. Instead, they remain suspended, creating a more stable modal environment in which quartal sonorities function as the primary harmonic framework. From this perspective, they too can be understood as a further development of harmonic tendencies and that are already present in day one, but without the same reliance on tertiary harmonic resolution as we just discussed. Now we move from a clearly articulated rhythmic and harmonic structure toward a different sonic condition. Here, the use of EBow fundamentally changes the articulation of the sound. The attack is no longer clearly defined, and the sound becomes continuous. As a result, the structure is no longer perceived through discrete events, but through the evolution of spectral energy. Let's give it a listen. Unlike the previous material, where phrase organization was shaped by discrete attacks, the EBow produced a continuously sustained sound. As a result, articulation shifts from individual events toward longer spectral processes. The segment begins with a contextual node that also functions as a spectral transition, rather than producing a clearly articulated attack. The EBow initiates a sustained spectral state. This marks the beginning of a new sonic dimension within the piece. This region corresponds to the highest level of spectral saturation within the segment. The sound is no longer organized through discrete attacks, but through a continuously sustained spectral field activated by EBow. And at the morphosyntactic level, the material is articulated through beta motif. Toward the end of the segment, spectral activity gradually decreases. The reduction of saturation functions as a spectral transition while also articulating the final contextual node. The segment closes without a cadential gesture, producing what the analysis identifies as a non-cadential closure. In contrast to the previous magnetic material, this segment is articulated primarily through changes in spectral behavior. Phrase organization emerges through saturation, density, and spectral transformation, rather than through discrete attacks. The spectrogram reveals an onset and stabilization in the first image here. Following the initial excitation, the spectrum rapidly settles into a sustained configuration. This corresponds to the opening contextual node and spectral transitions identified in the Allen analysis. In the second image, the saturation increase. We can observe a gradual increase in spectral saturation. Harmonic bands become more clearly defined and spectral energy becomes more concentrated. This corresponds to the saturation increase identified in the analytical layers. In the third image, or image C, a high-density spectral state. This example shows the highest level of spectral density within the segment we were talking about before in the Allen analysis video also. And D, in the final example, spectral energy gradually decreases. Harmonic content becomes less dense and the overall level of activity is reduced. This event functions simultaneously as a spectral transition and a contextual node articulating the closure of the segment. It's important to note that the parallel lines are indicated the overtones that are that can be perceived simultaneously with the fundamental sounds, and that is more likely to occur in a continuous excitation state of the string or of the instrument, rather than in picking situations or clear attacks, as we will see in the next example. We now move from continuous spectral articulation back to a sound defined through discrete attacks. Here, the picking reintroduces clearly articulated tone events organized into a denser and more compact gestural field. So at the syntactic level, period A is organized through a succession of antecedent and consequent phrases followed by leading into the next period. The material is articulated through the recurring cells X and Y and Z, which appear in different variants throughout the segment. Cell X, for instance, is defined by a band release gesture articulated through the interaction of tone events and idiomatic markers. And this establishes one of the principal gestural identities of the solo, of course, the band. Cell Y, in contrast to X, this material is based on hammer-on and pull-off gestures. The resulting legato articulation contributes to the continuity of the phrase while maintaining the same general motivic identity. And the cell Z, unlike the previous cells, Z is defined as a picking run generated through a succession of closely spaced tone events. The higher temporal density distinguishes it from the surrounding material. So if we go, for instance, to second. Then we get the first variation of X. Rather than introducing new material, the phrase extends previously established gestural configurations through transformation. If we go toward the end of the segment, the material returns to variants of the previously established cells. The phrase remains grounded in the interaction of X and Y, or their derived material, providing continuity across the period. So. In this example, because the same material often functions simultaneously at the motivic and phrasal levels, the distinction between morphosyntactic and morphological organization become less pronounced than in the previous examples. As a result, phrases frequently operate as motivic entities, while individual cells are identified only when they assume a distinct structural role. Moving to day 5, the material is organized as multi-layer structure. We can observe the interaction between harmonic progression, solo material, and gesture-based sound. These layers do not function independently, but are integrated within a single musical texture. Let's give it a shot. Here the material is organized as a multi-layer structure. We can observe the interaction between harmonic progression, solo material, and gesture-based sound. These layers do not function independently, but are integrated within a single musical texture. Moving forward, X and Y cells. We encountered the first presentation of those cells here at the beginning. These two units establish the basic material of the movement and will reappear throughout the section in different transformed versions. At this stage, the units remain clearly separated and can be perceived as individual gestural events. I removed the solo part and only leave the chords, the harmony, and the harmony and these cells that we are talking about here. So the difference between the two is that X cells are characterized by peak attack, and the Y cells are produced by using EBOW and slide. So for a better understanding, I provided here some videos. Moving toward the spectrogram, in the upper part, we observe the spectrogram where color represents the intensity of spectral energy. As mentioned earlier, brighter colors indicate stronger sound energy, while darker tones indicate lower energy. At the same time, the shape of the traces reflects how the sound is articulated, whether through clearly defined attacks or more continuous gestures. If we begin with the initial region corresponding to cell X, we can observe relatively compact spectral blocks with clearly defined contours and the concentration of energy in the lower and mid-frequency range, indicating a stable and clearly articulated gesture with a consistent spectral profile. Now we'll just try to move forward to the findings as the time flies off. So the first observation concerns the role of timbre and instrumental gesture. Traditionally, these elements are often treated as expressive features to an already existing musical structure. However, the analysis presented here suggests a more active role. Timbral behavior contributes directly to phrase articulation, helping define continuity, accumulation, and contrast within musical discourse. Instrumental gestures can also participate in musical syntax by shaping local articulations, points of emphasis, and directional movement. When these processes operate over larger spans, they contribute not only to individual phrases, but also to the emergence of formal relationships. In this sense, timbre and gesture function not merely as expressive resources, but as structural parameters within the musical discourse. The second observation concerns the limits of pitch-centered analysis. Pitch and harmony remain important analytical parameters, but the examples discussed throughout this presentation suggest that they do not act alone. Delayed decay can extend the perceptual connection between successive events and contribute to continuity, and differentiated over time. Similarly, can shape morphosyntactic relationship even when change. Rather than emerging exclusively from pitch of gap, these relationships appear to result from the interaction between harmonic timbral, spectral, and gestural processes. And the final observation concerns the methodology. One of the aims of this project was to explore how morphosyntactic and spectral morphological perspectives might operate together within a single analytical framework. In practice, the two approaches proved to be complementary. Morphosyntactic analysis helped clarify structural relationships and phrase organization, while spectrally informed observations provided additional insight into timbral behavior, spectral transitions, and sound evolution. For this reason, spectral morphology was not applied as a self-contained analytical system, but rather as a source of concepts and tools that could support the broader analytical process. Finally, the project demonstrated the continuous interaction between analysis and artistic practice. Analytical observations informed compositional and performance decisions, while artistic experimentation generated new analytical questions and perspectives. To conclude, this project suggests that timbre and instrumental gesture are not only expressive elements, but they can also contribute directly to phrase articulation, musical syntax, and formal organization. The analysis showed that morphosyntactic relationships may emerge not only through pitch and harmony, but also through timbral evolution, saturation, delayed decay, and idiomatic guitar techniques. The project also showed that selected spectral observations can enrich morphosyntactic analysis, helping us track timbral evolution, spectral transitions, and sonic density. Finally, Hexameron functioned both as an artistic work and as an analytical laboratory. Throughout the project, analytical observations frequently informed later compositional and performance decisions, creating a continuous feedback loop between analysis and artistic practice. Thank you. And sorry, I've been 8 minutes over the...
We are now open for questions. If any one of you have questions.
Hi. Hi, Gabriel. It's Sean and Damien here. How are you going? Congratulations. And hello.
Congratulations.
I'm wondering if you've had any interesting experiences or observations at the outer limits of the adaptability of your framework.
Regarding the adaptability of the framework, yes, it addresses any instrument. Actually, is not limited to electric guitar, as instrumental gestures and idiomatic characteristics, especially at stringed instrument, but also in electronic music, for instance, synths and other, I don't know, sampling can also operate with the units developed within this framework. So the limitations, of course, it wouldn't allow the same level of observation as, for instance, score analysis would. That's why I also try to include some of those examples showing, you know, the exact harmonic relationships that I was talking about. But in the same time, if it is combined with morphosyntactic analysis in the classic sense, like a Riemann approach of morphosyntactic analysis, then it can reveal way much more, or it can address way much more issues regarding music analysis rather than simply score or the classic analysis. So it has, of course, it has its limits. For instance, if you would analyze piano work, it wouldn't have the same impact because it would be not much left for the spectral analysis or the spectromorphology, which is studying the evolution of sound in time. So you have a time span where the sound modifies and transforms, or, you know, goes through different processes. This is more likely to happen in a context where instruments are also complemented by electronics. But it can go way much beyond electric guitar, and especially for, I don't know, for instance, if you can use a trumpet and a synth or a simulator, and along with all the mute system of the trumpet and the technique itself, you can also an example of that would be Pat Metheny, The Way Up, for instance. There is a trumpet solo in that piece where the trumpetist is using all sort of effects, and that is if you want to see findings in that sort of music, then applying this sort of this framework would be more classic analysis, which would basically say nothing, or at least not much, about the solo, because the whole music is it's not pitch centered music. It's more based on effects, sounds, and sound characteristics, approached ratherly in spectromorphology, in this radical approach to sound, initiated by Pierre Schaeffer and then developed by Smalley and the rest of them.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. We have any other question? Oh. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Congratulations for your lecture. And we invite you for the next lecture. That's going to be at 15:30. Thank you so much. Welcome again to the last lecture of the day. Today we have Molly Zackary that's going to do her presentation. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Molly Zackary, and my presentation is titled Repetition in Music and Social Media. This is part of the festival that we're all at. Repetition in music and social media. So really our locations of discourse today are going to be in music and in social media. We're going to be working with repetition in two modalities. One is as a device and the other is with mechanical devices. I just want to start out with who I am so that there's more context for my project, my research, everything that I worked on these last several months. I also make music under the name Molly Growler, and the lens that I'm trying to bring to this research, this talk, the work that I do out in the world is a feminist take on embodying philosophy. So the ontology of music, the ontology of repetition is not necessarily sufficient. It really needs to be actionable. It needs to be in a more concrete formula, you know, because these things impact us and they impact all of us. So looking at it through that lens, we are going to seek meaning-making philosophy that can be acted upon. A little bit more about who I am. This is just a screenshot of a project I've been working on, and it has the automation, some of the automation in it. And we're going to be talking about automation here, so I thought that that was relevant. I work with DAWs or DAWs. Largely. I also have electronic gear machines, as you can see here. So that's why machinery and human musical communication are definitely areas that, whoops, sorry. I want to get to the other tab. R. The tab in the browser.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there it is. Sorry. I do work with kind of an audio-visual diaristic perspective. So here's a little bit of a element, and you'll hear that there's a lot of repetition and a lot of machinery that's present here. So, repetition is a device that I use heavily. I think all musicians use it heavily, and I want to use it better, more meaningfully. So, I started a lot of my research, the beginnings of formulating them were with the Deleuze book, Difference and Repetition. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the Deleuzian ideas that will be included here so that you have a launching point. One is that repetition exposes difference, and that brings the potential for meaning, the difference that's embedded in all those repetitions. Two, repetition is identity forming. I'm going to expand on that. Three, identity that precedes repetition does not produce meaning-making difference. And then lastly, true freedom is not fully knowing things in advance. Therefore, creativity is an ideal location for true freedom to exist. Yeah, because when you're experiencing a work of art, you can't know everything, right? It's within the encounters of that work of art that its meaning begins to be revealed. I don't know if I'm going to be able to play this video, but the video is a bathroom in my hometown where there are all these copies of the famous painting, The Gleaners, but they're also different at the same time. Here in this research, I'm imposing some of my values. So we'll keep these in mind as we talk. One, people should be in a state of becoming. We're going to start from there. Art is the best medium that we have of delving into that state of becoming. Secondly, communication is a shared human ideal. And again, art is the best medium for exploring communication. Let's talk some more about repetition according to some of these value systems. I'm going to use capital R for repetition because that's the good thing that we're going to talk about today. That's going to be the thing that we are seeking to achieve is true repetition. Again, repetition contains inherent variation. The differences should emerge out of that repetition. Repetition is a reproduction with dissymmetry. No two copies are precisely alike. Repetition generates meaning through differences because communication occurs in those spaces. I'm going to call them intervals, and we're going to explore some of the intervals between the repetitions. Repetition also forces movement for the perceiver, both internally and externally. And in that process, identity emerges, especially an identity that is subject to change. Lowercase r is for replication, and that's the not as good thing in this talk. Replication subsumes variation. It is a reproduction without symmetry, or no, with symmetry. Reproduction with exact symmetry. That might be because it is mechanized or because the intention of the creator is for it to be as exact as possible in its copies. Replication is overly mediated to the point that the concept becomes a representation. Replication requires the precept of identity. So identity has to come before. And replication is especially desirable by capitalistic tendencies because it is scalable, right? I want to talk about why repetition, which in this value set is good, is a creative device that is worth exploring. And some of these things we really intuitively know, but it's nice to have some graphs, right? Repetition is an effective comprehension device. These are a couple of psychological theories about when you re-encounter something multiple times. For example, when children are learning languages, you re-encounter the words many times. In aesthetic realms, the more that you encounter that stimuli, the more likely you are to understand it, to become fluent in it, and to enjoy it. And there are studies on that. I think the fluency aspect is an important one, right? The more times you listen to fill-in-the-blank symphony, the more you feel like you understand that symphony. Repetition is also a very effective perception device. And it's a perception that the listener can have of the music. It's also a perception the listener can have of themselves. It's a perception that the musician can have of themselves. So there's self-perception as well as perception of others. That really helps us grasp and be fluent in each other's identities, right? So if you encounter a piece of music, you will have kind of your ideas, your initial reactions to it. You're going to formulate some sort of response. That's going to morph into attitude, and it feeds directly back into having another perception. So repetition in this way functions to take us deeper. That's why I like the spiral on the side, deeper and deeper and deeper into understanding. Repetition is a musical device that is communicative. I'm going to explore two different parameters so that we can kind of start to generate a little bit more of a graphable analyses. One is the amount of information. You can have a lot of information in your repetition, a medium amount of information contained therein, or a micro amount. You can think of this even in like maybe a chorus that repeats in a pop song is a mezzo repetition. Maybe a motif that repeats within a symphonic composition could be a micro amount of information. And then also across time. So these two things intersect. Here's a graph I made. So if we use these two parameters, we can start to think about how effective the repetition is behaving. And these are sort of randomly selected examples of music that we know to be repetitive, right? Everything from a drum circle, which is going to be highly repetitive over a very long span of time, to a jazz solo, which we think of as being much less repetitive and over varying spans of time. And then, of course, off in the corner, we have an outlier, which is social media. If you think of social media in totality, you've got lots of repetition in short spans of time. So we can start to create data or a way of thinking about this that reinforces some actionable values. All right, back to the Deleuze book, Difference and Repetition. This quote ended up really sticking with me, and I wanted to take it and run with it and try and develop it much further. He said, what happens within the system of repetition, what flashes across the intervals when a communication takes place between disparates. So I asked myself, what are all the possible intervals? Like, what are these intervals that communication can exist within? And what communication is happening within these intervals, which I found to be a really exciting way to think about what repetition does. These are just there's so many intervals that could exist, but between the thought that you have and the creation of the thing you thought of, between the order of operation and the end result, between the reproduction and the end product, between education and expertise, process and performance, song and show, riff and solo. These sort of distances, and within all of them, there's going to be this inherent communication that's always happening. This is another way that I want us to kind of keep in mind as we think about communication. This is from a therapist named John Gottman. He works with human interpersonal relationships and conflict resolution. And he really kind of drafted this idea that the person who is choosing to communicate in that moment has intent, but that's going to go through a filter, right? The interval that even the speaker themselves might have, it hits the listener's filter, and then the listener has an impact that they are perceiving. And in a conversation, of course, this would go back and forth, right? And the message that's in between does not always arrive in the exact same way that it was intended to. How does this relate to music? Well, music always has a listener. That's something that we depend upon as musicians. So this can help us to understand what we want our listeners, what we want to understand about our listeners, how deeply our message is penetrating through other filters, or if we want it to, right? The most important thing that this highlights for me is this idea of causality. The intent is that impetus, the reason that we decided to compose the piece of music or play the piece of music, has some kind of causation behind it. When we're talking about musical repetition, which is going to happen frequently through some duration, through some frequency through some duration in the piece, then there's many, many, many causalities at each iteration of the repetition. And true repetition is going to need differing causalities to emerge. That's where I think we get the difference that takes us to this meaning-making idea of difference and repetition. So, repetition is a form of reproduction. There's many forms of reproduction. Replication is also a form of reproduction. But just to summarize, repetition is going to provide possibilities of variance, which is a benefit to the music's ability to communicate. Whereas replication weakens the questions that live in that interval until they merely become statements. And this differentiation is going to help us really square how social media behaves right now with what our intentions are as musicians. And I have one more scale. So I took the same items that were on the previous graph, but now they're ordered from lowest possibility of variance to highest possibility of variance. You may disagree with how I ordered these. But the important thing is that social media again behaves as a very notable outlier. It's low possibility of variance. Before we move on to social media as the second location of study, I just want to draw out a couple more concepts to help us evaluate the functionality of reproduction in its many forms. So we're going to look at memory and also recall. The process, this is something that scientists are learning more and more about, is how we even work with memory in our brains. And one of the ways that they have determined that we work with it is that the memories are stored kind of in a little file cabinet. And when you have a stimuli that triggers a recall, you pull the memory out of storage. Something that I think is really critical is that when you pull it out of storage, the memory is actually destabilized. It changes and it morphs, and when you put it back into the file cabinet, the memory is not the same as when you first pulled it out. And we do this over and over again because we recall our memories frequently throughout our lives. It's important that this destabilization occurs when you recall the memory, because we don't want to be the same person when we remember an event from our previous life. We don't want to be the same person that we were in that moment. We want to be a person whose identity is continually evolving and forming. And I think that this helps us understand how we ideally want music to behave and to reach us. Okay, there's friction involved in pulling a memory out of a file cabinet, recalling it, allowing it to be vulnerable to destabilization, and then placing it back in a changed form in that memory bank. All of those steps represent friction. So I'm also presenting the idea that repetition, when done in a very true and authentic form, gives us that friction, unlike social media, which flattens friction. And I think we as a society are coming to terms with this process right now and finding that we really want friction, that it is ultimately beneficial to us. Okay, so let's talk about social media. There's a lot to it. Everybody's on social media, so there's a lot we already know about it. I want to create a little bit of a discrete timeline. I am from the United States, and so September 11th was obviously a very big event. That was in the year 2001. And that's kind of a convenient timeline for us We had LiveJournal back in 1999. We had Friendster in 2003, and Facebook as the Harvard server was 2004. So a lot of the things that we think of as the beginnings of social media coincided with this era. Now, as somebody from the US who remembers 9/11, the event was very notable to me because it was a constant replay of the exact same imagery. And more importantly, the imagery was coupled with the same conclusion over and over again, the exact same narrative about the event. There weren't new images, nor were there new arrivals, and certainly discourse was very flattened during that time for folks in the United States. I like this quote. In the electronic square, which is what we're talking about today, the gruesome visuals of calamity replayed day after day, as if footage could substitute for fathoming and repetition for revelation. Susan Faludi is not using repetition with a capital R, which I'm placing high value on, but we get the idea that we become litigators instead of communicators. All right. Social media leads us all to become consumers. And this is generated by AI, which is more recent on our discrete timeline of the early aughts through right now. However, I think that kind of the extreme idea that's being represented by these AI-generated videos that we can see are replications with really very little variance. It looks like there's variance, but it's an illusory variance here, right? Social media relies upon copies of imagery. The imagery has to feel familiar. There are doubling of frequencies. So even the narrative that's on these images is copies of each other. And it's all in order to stabilize identity. Identity needs to arrive first before the content is generated. And all content has to replicate that identity and reinforce it in order for the narrative to be as stable as it possibly can be. And that leads us to not just consume literal goods and services, but to consume the social media itself, which is kind of the most important part of social media. As musicians, I think we all have a very unfortunate and maybe groan-worthy relationship with social media because it just forces us into low-wage production. Reproduction is a risky position because it can be either repetition or replication. We don't know which it is. Is it repetition that we are reproducing where we discern variance, where the differences help us make more meaning out of it, or are we doing replication? I didn't get enough attention on this post, so I'm going to post something almost the exact same again. We know that artists have to engage in reproduction within the social media electronic square. We try to do it on our own terms, but I would argue that it's really, really difficult because the labor of reproduction on social media distracts from the labor of devising creative works of art. And our attention becomes both the labor and the commodity at the same time. And again, we are moved closer and closer towards stabilizing our identity instead of allowing room for it to be destabilized. Attention, memory, and fluency in social media, how we all become data. The intent and the impact of social media are all the same. It's just funneling us into data. Research shows that the short form videos are really deteriorating people's attention span. The attention spans are likewise becoming shorter and shorter. People sometimes talk about digital dementia, where the recall of what you've seen is actually a hindrance on how social media needs you to operate while you're on their platforms. And we talked about how the memory bank and the pulling it out to recall it is actually a really important process for us in how we form our identity. We know that social media platforms are giant corporations and businesses with dollar signs as their bottom line. There's something called the network effect, which is their goal is to control your behavior so that they can scale up your capturability. Your data, for one, your reproductions, everything that you create for the social media platform, your time, your rote actions like swiping, liking, etc., all just stream money to the network, whereas the network is never at any moment concerned with your satisfaction in the product because you aren't the consumer. You are the producer of the data which is consumed by other business conglomerates. I showed that picture of my automation in the DAW before. On social media, the algorithm is the automation. Repetition is something that produces for culture, whereas replication produces for capitalism, and social media is on the side of capitalism. Additionally, it habituates your responses and generates your judgment before your understanding. Again, how we become litigators. I want to talk a little bit about how social media flattens our communication very dramatically. We're all struggling to adopt and adapt to various button logics because we live in a world with machines, and those machines help us and facilitate our communication, including right now what's happening. I'm pushing buttons, right? I like to use synthesizers full of buttons and knobs, but maybe button logic poses the same risk that reproduction does, which is that it can lead us to true and authentic repetition, where we can get meaning making, or replication, which really subsumes meaning making. We talked a little bit about how social media capitulates to scalability. That's why I think you'll see little snippets of people's songs. Sometimes the songs are slowed down or sped up, just for real, so it's like they're removed from their own original meaning. Social media is parasocial. Its communication is only one-sided. And all attempts at communicating are reduced to a cost-benefit analysis by the consumer, or the user, really is what I mean. The user, which is us. If attention has the illusion of purchasing power, like if we feel that our attention and what we spend it on is our purchasing power, then social media is perceived as expensive to us. And anything less than a dopamine reward is attention poorly spent. So that's social media, but we need to put these things together. The goal of my research is to have access points. Again, we want embodied philosophy, actionable analysis. We want our interaction with machinery to move forward so that we feel like we can make decisions that are as communicative as possible. So I have some theorems. 1, more music made by humans is better for music. 2, all culture that has human hand in the making has a hand in making culture. Let's break this down a little bit. Axiom number 1 that I present to you. Art encourages us to be better communicators. I stated that early on. So what do we do with that? So here's an axis point that we can work with in today's electronic square. The artist can forecast the differentiated causalities, thereby giving more possibilities of variance to be better communicated. In the repetition, can you personally be tuned in to the repetitions that you're creating? Whether you are playing an instrument that is playing the same Philip Glass arpeggio over and over again, in which case each iteration of the arpeggio, can you forecast the differentiated causality? Or if you're working with a machine, can there be causalities that you build into the machinery? The audience is likewise there to learn to communicate better. So you're giving them a gift. Axiom number 2, music has both stabilizing and destabilizing properties. eloquently expressed through repetition. So it's not that we never want to be stable, but just like our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world, going through processes of identity destabilization helps us grow. And then we can remain in a stable place in order to take action on it. We want both of these things. How does a musician take action on that idea? We can make music that drifts, degrades, contains additive and subtractive elements, glitches, presents open as well as closed modules. Axiom 3, we're in a human-machine relationship. That's just how it is. How do we act upon that responsibly? As musicians, we can challenge system designs and operational statuses via human mediation. So the system may have a design, there may be an operation that's been programmed, but we as humans want to intercede that and provide mediation, and accept all results as potential communication. Axiom 4, all media is trending towards the lowest demand cognition. That is precisely how social media behaves. They want you to think less and less and less, so you stay on their platforms longer and longer. So what's the antidote to that? Music should demand attention, should invite reflection and processing through friction, because actually we want friction. So as artists, we can provide the friction that people so desperately want, and we should. Axiom 5, which is my last axiom. Musicians produce in a capitalist market that seeks complete capture of the production. Art made for art's sake is the most vulnerable to capture. I was reading a Camus essay from 1958, long time ago, but very relevant today. He was living in a post-World War II reality and trying to parse that out and what that meant for art and artists. And he said, artists find themselves trapped inside the amphitheater. Their voices naturally no longer sound the same. He was responding to his perception that before World War II, artists could imagine themselves as making art for art's sake. But after World War II, that was no longer possible. And I think that we're going through a very radical reconfiguration of communication in our society right now, and making art for art's sake leaves us vulnerable to being capturable by these platforms. So we'll take Camus' advice and ponder what it means to find ourselves trapped inside the amphitheater. But here is my axis of how we can kind of challenge this. Musicians must be able to refuse complete capture by capitalist markets while still finding a capitalist landscape survivable materially. Make art that has extended circulation, like it's not meant for one consumable good, right? It's art that can live across spans of time. It's art that can have recall at later dates and digested in a differently stabilized form. Art that teaches, art that is fluid as well as fluent. And the repetition, again, helps people feel fluent in the art itself. We can reorganize zones of practice to evaluate the potential for variability within each. And then, as a closer, I'm not gonna be able to play this. I had a video of a performance where I had various synthesizers, machines of music making set up on the stage, and I would trigger an element on an individual clock, and they were not synced up on BPM, so they were like on totally different timelines. And then I would circle the room and I would sing improvisatorially over the machines that were clocking over there on the stage. And then I'd come back around and I'd manipulate the machines, and then I would walk around the room. And so it highlights that machine-human interaction There's lots of repetition, but hopefully repetition that helps difference to emerge. And in addition, there's like an acoustic experience that's sort of different for every member of the audience. So the impact is also baked into how this behaves for each of the people in the audience. I need you to swing by my laboratory ensemble experiment on Thursday at the Hotel Astoria at 3:30 because I'm going to impose social media conditions upon the laboratory ensemble, but I need platform users to be the social media experience upon those musicians. So I would love it, even if like a handful of you guys can come and interrupt the musicians, and we'll get some data collection about the experience of communicating with social media type conditions imposed upon them. That is my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions. Yes, sure. We do? Okay. I will take some questions. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you very much, Molly. It was such an outstanding presentation. Do we have any questions for her? Yeah.
So hello, first of all, thanks for the nice presentation. I actually don't have two questions, but I have two takes on what you just said, and I wonder I'm actually curious how you react to them, because obviously I have way less expertise than you in this field, so it's more like a gut feeling from my part, but I wonder what you make with it. So the first point I'm having is, it's 2 points for replication, actually. So first of all, like as children, we, or at least I, but many others probably as well, used to replicate like our idols. Or for musicians, when we probably started off our journey in music with replicating whatever our teacher was telling us to do or how to do it. Because in the beginning, you don't really have a sense of direction or a sense of art when you're a child. And as part of this becoming of an artist, you need to replicate in order to have an input and to get this sense of direction. And from there, of course, you develop and you start not only replicating, but also repeating, as you say. But I think like as an initial spark, it for me does not sound, it sounds almost inevitable to me, like when I'm just thinking about it. And the second point I'm having is specifically about the slide you had about AI. And this might be a bit of a hot take, but I think the AI replication, especially in music now, might be one of the best things that, still not sure, but it might be one of the best things that came out in the last few years in terms of music, because it forces exactly, which you kind of alluded to, it forces musicians to become artistic again, because it is no longer feasible to replicate something. And we've all listened to the radio and heard pop songs, and lots of them sound, I could not tell you if it's one song or the other if I deleted the lyrics off of it, right? And this is no longer, or it's becoming less and less feasible to do it, because AI can just do it better and faster. So why would a record company employ you as an artist, right? But the human factor and the artistic factor is, at least for now, still something that is not replicable by AI. So while replication in that sense is negative, it can have a positive impact, because it forces us to not be lazy, or it forces us to go beyond again. So I was just wondering, what do you think about that?
Those are two great points with replication. I do agree with what your first point is in the learning process of music. Specifically music, we'll take music. Oftentimes the goal in the early parts of the journey are to replicate these masterworks. with the, observance and guidance of a, master teacher, right? I think, though, we also implicitly understand that that is not the final destination, that we're supposed to evolve and move out of that replication stage and create the variances that we know that the artistry comes out of. So you are correct. I think when I think about replication as risky, and why I talked about it being capturable, is that in current media squares that we participate in, the goal is to keep us in that replication stage. Like, it's not in order for us to evolve out of it, and then find those variances. The second point you made, I think, is really interesting. I do think that AI has appropriately terrified artists because the music that we're used to hearing on the radio, AI can make better than really any living musician. It's a singer who's never going to be out of key, right? And you can make art that is extremely palatable and non-challenging, so therefore commercially successful. I don't know if I'm prepared to say that that is good. That maybe is your hot take. What was the thing I was going to say? Maybe it'll come back to me. But those were two good observations.
Any other question?
Yes. Just to kind of like carry on that similar, or those two similar points, and the idea of that learning stage and being replication is there's an inherent idea of like perfection in that is unattainable, so that inevitably, even if you try and replicate something as like a learning task, you end up, I'm trying to make sure I get the terminology correct, but it ends up being this repetition of something that has these micro variations, and it's actually from that we then start to develop our own voice. So I would first of all like criticize the previous question on like distinguishing between those two things. But my other question about replication is, can replication actually truly exist, even if you identically copy something over and over again, particularly in time, because we change as individuals going through it, our response is going to change each time, so that in a sense nothing can ever be truly replicated. There's always going to be some element of repetition there, and just how do we factor that in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good question, and actually it reminded me what I wanted to say about AI music. But I'm going to talk about cooking for a second, because I think cooking is going to illustrate what I mean to say. When McDonald's made their hamburger recipe, if you can call it a recipe, assemblage, if you will, the goal and the purpose of McDonald's was to ensure that every hamburger at every McDonald's tastes as close to the same as possible. So the intent in that communication diagram, intent and impact, the intent is make sure no matter where you get your McDonald's hamburger, the impact is familiarity. Low cognitive load, low expectation. You can have a restaurant with a chef who has come up with some pasta recipe, and maybe like 50 people a night order the pasta recipe. But the interaction of that chef and the intention that every bowl of pasta be as good as it possibly can be allows for more space for the causality to be variant. Maybe the chef is on the second pasta of the night and the supplies are fresh and he has lots of energy. Maybe by the 15th pasta, she is getting a little bit tired, the supplies are running down, she calls out to the prep staff to chop some more of this, that, or the other. So the causality is evolving through the night, even though the customers are ordering the same item on the menu. And I think customers have a greater tolerance in like a sit-down restaurant experience to know that even if your best friend said it's the best ravioli they've ever had, when you order the ravioli, it's okay for you to say that you didn't think it was good, right? So the causality is this really important thing. And when I think about AI, AI wants to condense and shorten that interval that we talked about between causality and the reproduction itself, right? So you can tell AI to make a song and it will make a song in 5 seconds, a fully fleshed out pop song. Lyrics, verse, chorus, right? And it could even be like pretty catchy. But there was so little communication in the interval that I think on a really intuitive level, like how we know that the ravioli, it might not be our favorite ravioli. It's okay for us to disagree. If there's a greater interval, the communication is sensed more. I think it's better sensed by us. And then that's the communication benefit. I think to me, that's the line. Can you say that replications are like exact copies on a scientific level? No. But I think that the interval is really, really, really small. So small that we don't even have to engage with it if we don't want to.
So I just remembered another question I had, which was just at some point in your lecture, at various points, you kind of used some kind of idea of better and worse. And one particular point was the idea of kind of human-made music being better than repetition, than commercially made or artificially made music. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what better means in this sense, and to sort of challenge that. And this isn't like my personal view, but you could say that the success that you're able to have with pushing all of this AI music means on a like quantitative level to certain people, you could say, well, that is better. What is your idea of better in this context?
I appreciate that question because I think there's room to address that. There's a certain vagueness that I wrote into these theorems. More music, so really just more, like more than there is at this moment. It made by humans, and made, I think, can be like a gray area that we can inhabit here, is better for music as a whole. I think in general, more people engaging with producing creative works is like a net benefit, no matter how you slice it. Just put more of that into the world, right? Not as content, but as production, right? All culture that has a human hand in the making, so like any manipulation, like the more humanness that we bring to it, the more likely we're gonna have possibilities of variance and therefore possibilities of meaning making. And therefore, what I think makes it better is that our communication is deepened instead of flattened.
Yeah.
You want to say something? One more?
I'll have a think about it, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I, of course, also believe that being an artist is great and makes you a better person, but I wanted to ask you about how you would integrate into what you just unpacked, the kind of ideology of creativity and the fact that being an artist is also, on at least like in some version, a highly desirable social position, and it's very much marketed, and it's something that is promoted on social media, right? So in a way, everybody is supposed to be an artist, and artists are also great consumers, right? They buy like the Spotify blah 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 plan to get more exposure, and then they buy like the new update to Ableton, and then they buy a contact library and so on, right? And they are always mobile, they accept everything, right? They work for no money and so on. So, and of course, this is, you could say this is all outside of the art that they then produce, but it affects very much what you have to do to actually be able to say you're an artist, right? And so how does that factor into the art making, and how can the art making in itself address this?
Those are good questions. I think I have a really hard time parsing out my own relationship with capitalism, because it's a necessary, right? You know? Drawing something beautiful doesn't necessarily just pay the rent because it just exists, right? I think we would do well to accept creativity in a diverse deliverable, right? So I think what is currently happening with musicians is that we're funneled into, well, you need to buy the SoundCloud premium account so that we'll promote your tracks. You need to purchase this package from, this streaming platform or this streaming platform so that you can get eyes on you, right? And I'm not here to dog any musician who makes any of those decisions at all, because we have to do what we have to do. We got to eat a sandwich at the end of the day, right? Or for breakfast, could be for breakfast. I think, though, that's one deliverable. That's one package for how it moves from you to a listener. It's the mobility of the creative work, I think, that in part you're talking about. I'm not prepared to fully dissect that, but I think that's cool.
I can give like a more concrete example.
Yeah.
So this is not from me, but there was a recently pretty famous essay by Josh Klein, who is an like visual artist, and he made the observation, among others, that because pressure, like economic pressure, is so high, more artists tend towards painting than, for example, video art and like installation and so on, because you can easily sell a painting as opposed to like something that's very hard to put up and like you can only display it once, and you can extend this to music easily, right? So you go on tour by yourself with just your laptop, as opposed to having like a 5-people band, because in order to put a 5-people band on stage, you already need like 2 different grants from the government. In case you're in Germany, right? In the US, you probably don't get them anyways. You don't have them, right? But so it's super complex to even do like a modestly kind of artistically interesting thing.
Yes. And also I do like Aphex Twin, so going on tour with just your laptop doesn't necessarily mean you're making something less. Yes, I think there's still, regardless of how you're going on tour, there's still so many elements on like whether or not you're capitulating to a media capture or not. Like there are bands that like work social media really, really well, and it financially benefits them. It's really hard work. The people I know who do well with it work really, really hard at that exact feature. So I think we need more options instead of just winning at Instagram. I don't know. This is a good conversation. We'll continue it.
Great, thank you very much, Molly. Thank you very much for your questions, and we wait for you tomorrow to continue with the lectures. Thank you.